Welcome to Chapter 1 of your MA course, Management Information. Let's start with an intro to what we mean by cost and management accounting in Section 1. We're going to talk about three main types of accounting. Now, the middle area, management accounting, is what we're really focused on, but it's important to get a feel for other areas of accounting. And I'll assume just a very small amount of knowledge in these early chapters, and particularly this one. Let's talk firstly about financial accounting. So, in essence, we're talking about recording, processing, and reporting of financial information to produce financial statements. So we're really talking externally to the business. We know that any business, for-profit business, has a series of transactions. Those transactions will be recorded and processed in some way in an accounting system. And the aim of that is to produce information in the form of, let's say, a profit and loss account and a balance sheet. Now, there are other areas too, but let's keep it simple just for the moment. Now, the importance of financial accounting is many and varied, in particular in relation to external users, but also internal as well, directors, management, etc. But let's think about it. Those financial statements invariably will be filed. They'll be filed with tax authorities. They'll be filed perhaps with a company's house type body, etc. So there are a variety of stakeholders, both internal and indeed external, that rely on financial accounting and indeed the financial statements. And obviously the FA course will sort of prime you so much more than the MA course in those areas. What about management accounting? Now, this is more internally focused. Note that we're talking about financial and, note, non-financial information to support management activities. So whilst financial accounting is sort of geared and influenced by compliance, in other words, compliance with laws, regulations, you need to file accounts with the tax authorities, you need to file them with government bodies. Management accounting is much more flexible. In other words, management can decide the activities that they will undertake to produce and indeed prepare financial and non-financial information. Now, just a quick note on non-financial. That's an important area, and that area has become much, much more important over the last 10 to 20 years. And what I mean briefly, and this will influence various subjects in your ACCA qualification. In essence, what we're talking about is that really reporting and indeed information that's produced for reporting can be twofold. And non-financial information, for example, something like quality, something like the customer perspective, areas outside of the number crunching has become more and more relevant in recent years. Watch out for that. What about cost accounting? Well, this is really a sort of a subset, if you will, or indeed a function of management accounting. Only one function. Now, it's mentioned here, and we talk about identifying costs. Now, you may think the idea of identifying costs, let's say for product A, is quite straightforward. Well, in one way it is, but there are a myriad or a plethora, a variety of different approaches to evaluating the costs associated with product A. For example, the traditional approach, absorption costing or marginal costing, or perhaps more modern approaches, as we'll see, like ABC, activity-based costing. So costing is a large area within management accounting. And indeed, the MA examiner will focus in your exam on the various different techniques that management can use to identify costs. Let's move from here to a broader area. In other words, the idea of accounting fitting in somewhere. So really this idea of planning, decision making and control, that's the essence of management accounting. So if anyone was to say to you, oh, well, can you define management accounting? Really, you'd have to use those three words. Absolutely. Now, what do we mean by them? Well, in essence, what management accountants need to do is plan, and much of the information that they will produce is based around planning. A simple example might be a budget or a forecast. And then outside of that, what they'll need to do is, broadly speaking, compare budgets, let's say, to actuals, and make decisions that will help them control the organization. So this sort of three-pronged area of planning in the first instance, actions in some kind, perhaps comparing actual to budget, and indeed controlling and going around in a loop, is the key essence of management accounting. More of that later. Now, outside of that, we talked about information, and indeed, we talked about decisions. So note that sort of different types of planning and decisions are taken at different levels in the management hierarchy. If you're working at the moment, I would guess that there are several levels or hierarchies within your particular organization. Really strategic at the top, tactical sort of in the middle, think middle level management, and then operational, think functional or shop floor, perhaps day-to-day activities in a manufacturing organization, for example. Now, in essence, what we need to have within any organization for management accounting purposes is alignment, or if you will, congruence between these areas. What we've got to make sure is the strategic plans at the top cascade down through middle management, i.e. tactical, and then again down to the shop floor or day-to-day activities. So you might think of strategic as sort of long-term, very important high-end decisions, tactical in terms of, well, how do we put those long-term high-end decisions into play, in the short to medium term, and then outside of that, operational, day-to-day. Let's move from there to the idea of data and information. Now, this is important because, you may well think, well, data and information, that's the same thing. Well, actually, it's not, certainly not for our purposes. Data is the raw stuff. It's the raw facts and figures. Information is data that has been processed in some way. Let's be very, very clear on the difference between those two things. There's one thing having some data, but what you need to do is to process it, put it into a form that it makes sense, that you can make informed decisions on it. And that's what management should do with data. Think about a simple accounting system. The data might be purchase invoices or sales invoices or petty cash receipts. When that information is processed within a transaction processing system into, let's say, a set of management accounts, now that's information. We can make some decisions based on information. It could be variances, it could be profitability for the last month, etc., etc. Moving from there, when we think about classifying data, two main areas here. Now think of this in terms of management accounting, but also perhaps think of it in terms of perhaps research. Let's say that as a strategic management accountant going forward, you're involved in decisions that the company is making at a corporate or strategic level. You might be tasked with researching information. So really, primary data is collected directly from the source, and note secondary data collected from someone other than the primary user. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, think about it. Some information is quite easily had. So, as an example, if I was looking for management information in relation to results over the last 3 months, that would be fairly easy to find. because I could simply dig in to the management accounting system. The source is the company. Let's say if we were to go outside the company to look for information that's not internal, perhaps in relation to a competitor, perhaps in relation to industry statistics, etc. That's collected by someone other than the primary user, i.e. us. So broadly speaking, you might think of sort of primary data in one way as sort of internal data, although it doesn't have to be, and secondary information or data that's been collected elsewhere that you look for perhaps outside the organization. What about sources of data and information? Well, quite a few. Firstly, internal. Now, as I've just mentioned, the accounting system, the historical accounting system, and indeed the records, house all transactions. We know that an accounting system is going to store, purchase invoices, sales, petty cash, bank transactions, etc., etc., etc. So there's a myriad of information there. In addition to that, obviously employees and managers have a lot of information in relation to the company. Some may be with the company for many, many years. That is, skills, know-how, information about competitors, information about past successes, etc., etc. Outside of that, perhaps for a manufacturing organization, if we dig deeper down into the cost of sales, we'll have production records. And in addition to that, clearly, administration is also important. Other records might include something like payroll records. So internally, there are a variety of areas that management and directors can go for information. What about external sources? Well, first thing first, why bother? We have a lot of information in-house. We've been operational for many years. Why do we need to go outside? Well, certainly we need to adhere and comply with rules and regulations. We know that the business landscape is complex and is becoming more and more complex. Think of data protection as an example. Think of big data and security concerns. Outside of that, we know that outside the organization, there's a lot of information, particularly now, in relation to the industry, perhaps from a government body, or possibly in relation to competitors. What are competitors doing? Are they launching new products? Why aren't we? So, in terms of sources, a variety. Government agencies certainly is one. The press, the media, even libraries, and a variety of other online resources. Let's move from there in terms of sort of sources of data. Clearly, in modern day business, machine or sensor data is all around us. A simple example might be a supermarket or possibly a card key for employees to access or leave a business. Really, we're talking about data gathered from some sort of device. RFID springs to mind. Outside of that, transactional data would be the obvious one to think of. Why? Well, we're talking about the transactions of a business. So, for example, when we delve in or dive in to the accounting system, we know that the transaction processing system, i.e. the accounting system, houses every single transaction, or at least it should do, for the last week, the last month, the last year, the last 5 years. So, along with machine or sensor data, certainly transactional data is important. Obviously, more recently, human social information, social media posts, even handwritten letters, phone calls, etc., everything derived from people, particularly in the area of social media. You and I both know how prevalent, businesses using perhaps social media data analytics and information derived online, Facebook, Instagram, etc., to leverage competitive advantage and how important that has become. Outside of that, costs. Bottom line with data is yes, we need it, but we certainly need to be aware of the cost benefit. Now, in terms of direct data, we saw across the way, if we're talking about data captured directly from the source, broadly speaking, that information may be a little bit easier or perhaps less costly. Indirect data, not directly from the source, perhaps from another source, maybe a government body, maybe online, maybe an agency. More than likely, time is involved and possibly a cost too. We need to be careful that accessing information or the costs of accessing information doesn't outweigh the benefits of using that information. Next area for us is attributes of good information. Now, this will be something that you have seen before, and I'll refer you to the mnemonic within the ACCA Study Hub chapter, and indeed the various qualities. It's a fairly straightforward area. It doesn't tend to get examined that regularly, but let's think about it. If you're working as a director, a CFO, or a management accountant, you need to ensure that the information that you're getting, perhaps from your subordinates, perhaps from your colleagues, has certain qualities. We're talking about things like timeliness. We're talking about things like relevance, etc., etc. So I'll refer you in this instance to the mnemonic accurate in the Study Hub. Moving from there, something that I mentioned early on, big data and data analytics. Now, within MA, this is certainly a topic that can be examined fairly regularly, but also it appears in a variety of other subjects within your ACCA qualification. This is something that if you're not familiar with, you don't have to become an expert in, but certainly get a fix on the next few minutes and the basics of big data. So what do we mean? We're really talking about this collection of data that sort of increases exponentially over time, volume, variety, velocity. And indeed, this information and businesses using this information over the course of the last 20 years or so, since that buzzword, big data, has become important, allows a sort of a change in traditional data processing methods and indeed the analysis of information. What big data effectively means is there is so much data out there now. We've got to find ways to capture it, structure it into meaningful information and make decisions, extract value from it. Further to that, what we know about big data is that the sort of core definition has sort of morphed over time. Let me just get this in the right place for you. What I mean by that is that when the sort of buzzword sort of big data came into play, it came into play via an individual called Doug Laney back in around about 2001, 2002 or thereabouts. And, the 3 V's were coined by this individual, Doug Laney, this expert on data: volume, velocity, and variety. And then Gartner, the entity, the business information entity, added veracity. More recently, value has been added. So we really started with the 3 V's back in the noughties. Veracity was added around about then too. And then more recently, value. So let's walk through them. Now remember that if you were asked to sort of define big data, you certainly need to be thinking about these areas. You won't be asked to do that within an MA OT question, but certainly going forward, understand what each of these 5 V's mean. If you just understand that, you're in good shape. Now, volume is an obvious one, isn't it? We're talking about the amount of information being captured these days, and indeed in recent years, through a variety of different means: social media, customer relationship management systems, sensors, etc., etc., etc. I mean, think about a supermarket as an example. How many different forms of data does a supermarket capture? A multitude. So it needs to find ways, and many larger supermarkets do find ways to extract value from that volume. Outside of that philosophy, obviously, the speed, with the internet, with tech, and indeed the advances in tech, the speed at which data is being streamed into systems and organizations is increasing clearly. It needs to be captured, and indeed it needs to be captured in an efficient and a timely manner. Outside of that, again, quite obvious. Outside of how much data volume, how quickly it's coming, it's the variety. Many, many different forms. Again, using the supermarket example, point of sale, WhatsApp, text messages, email, handwritten letters, customers coming to the counter, etc., etc. The amount of information and the variety is massive. Now, veracity, as I mentioned, this particular area, or this particular V, was added by Gartner a couple of years after Doug Laney, the sort of founder of the three V's, as it were, coined the phrase, the three V's of big data. We're talking about accuracy. We're talking about truthfulness. Now, this is key, really, when you think about it, because it's all well and good having a lot of information coming at you quickly in different forms. But if you can't rely on it, if it's not accurate, if it's not truthful, then making decisions based on that data is going to be tricky, or making the right decisions. You've got to ensure the veracity of data to ensure that the decisions that you make are on point. Now, as mentioned, more recently, value has come into play. And this buzzword, value, is certainly important because really the idea of a cost v benefit analysis of data is central to the use of data. We've got to make sure that just because we're focused on the myriad and plethora of data that's coming our way, we don't waste time. We need to be able to extract value, trends, patterns, etc. And we need to ensure that the cost doesn't exceed or outweigh the benefit. That's a key problem for businesses. Moving from there, in terms of the use, you're familiar with the term data analytics, and I've touched on it once or twice already within this particular mind map. We've talked about the 5 V's. At the end of the day, what's the use of big data? Well, the key point is that businesses have unstructured data. For example, a supermarket coming in from so many different forms. What they've got to do is find ways to process it accurately and to turn it into structured data sets so that they can derive meaning. What does derive meaning mean? Well, a trend, a pattern. A supermarket will look at purchase patterns for customers, perhaps leading up to the Christmas period, and see what is bought early, what's bought in the middle of December, and possibly even what's bought after the Christmas period. That's about trends and patterns, and indeed, competitive advantage for supermarkets. Some specific examples. Well, I mentioned, a supermarket. Strategy is key. We can derive strategy at a corporate or strategic level from looking at masses of big data. It may well be that we see a new product, for example, is selling much, much more than we thought, or we've surmised that a new product launched by a competitor is selling much more than our products. So perhaps our strategy going forward is more input into R&D. Outside of that, customer satisfaction. We know more and more now, as mentioned in terms of the non-financial areas at the beginning of this mind map, that non-financial factors, for example, the quality of our product, what our customers think of us, what we can do to satisfy them, is absolutely key to business. It's not all about profit and loss. We've got to think about other areas. So big data can help us get to know our customers better. Outside of that, it may well be that forecasting is facilitated in an easier manner through the use of big data and indeed patterns of sales in a particular period. Moving from there, as with everything, in the ACCA qualification, there's always several sides to the coin, and there is several sides to this coin. The first thing or issue with big data is something that we've already mentioned: accuracy. We need to make sure that we get accurate information, and that may be not as easy as we think. It'll depend on our sources, it'll depend on our systems, and indeed our hard work. The accuracy of the information that we use is key. Linked with that, in one sense, is technology. It's all well and good saying we have a lot of information coming in, but are we capable of using it? Big data analytics is a complex area. If we decide, well, listen, we need to use big data more extensively in our organization in the next year, do we have the expertise? How is that going to cost itself? How much resources, time, effort are we need to put into this area in order to derive some benefit from it? Last point is obviously security and privacy. Now, this is something, as I mentioned earlier on, that's become more and more important for businesses. If you're storing a lot of information, for example, about customers, about their personal details, their credit card details, their purchase patterns, etc., 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 we need to ensure compliance with data protection, GDPR, etc., etc. So, big data comes with lots of opportunities, for sure. But let's remember the potential downsides as well. Now, in terms of management information broadly, we've talked about a number of different areas so far in this particular mind map. We haven't really said that there are limitations. So are there, and what are they? Well, first things first, again, a topic area that I've mentioned a few times is time and cost. In other words, benefit. The other issue for us is really the idea that when we think about transaction processing systems and we think about the transactions of a business, invariably they're historic. Management accountant, tends to look forward or tries to look forward. It's difficult to look forward. And indeed, it's difficult to expend time focusing or trying to get budgets right, trying to get forecasts right, particularly in a landscape or an environment, a business environment that changes rapidly. That's going to take more time. It's going to cost us more money. Outside of that, as just mentioned, when we're extrapolating forward, much of what we have in terms of useful information or accurate is past. Just because information or something happened in the past, let's say a sales pattern, sales values, etc., doesn't necessarily mean that that same pattern will follow through in the future. It's very, very difficult to budget. Outside of that, more often than not, management information can be incomplete. We may not have everything that we need. Some amount of guesswork can be required. Think clearly or simply, let's say, about a budget for sales. We're really guessing at the end of the day. So looking forward, forecasting, budgeting, using variance analysis, etc., is fraught with difficulty because sometimes certain parts of the information that we have are incomplete. So that concludes our first chapter, management information. Some useful areas there, particularly in terms of definitions. In addition to that, I would say certainly the area of big data is important for us. I will emphasize as we go from chapter to chapter the areas that I think are more geared towards OT questions. The ACCA Study Hub is excellent, but it does have a lot of padding information. So what we've done, obviously, within these mind maps is try to sort of shave it down a little bit to save you some time by focusing on the examinable topics. So I hope you found this particular first mind map video helpful, that your studies are going well so far, and that you're going to work hard through these chapters towards success. Many thanks for listening.